Parsha Pairings with Jeff and Sherry. I'm Jeff Friedlander.
And I'm Sherry, and we're so glad you've joined us today. I want to remind you to please go to our channel, B1 Ministries, and be sure to hit the bell so you can be notified when we have new videos that are posted. And if you are enjoying these teachings, we would love to hear from you in the comments, as well as have you like and share them with other people. You can also download our app, the B1 Ministries app, from anywhere that you download your apps, and you will have access to these as well.
All right. So this week we're in Parsha Matot Masei. It's a double portion Parsha. And today we've already done a couple videos that you can pick up in those places, the website, the app, etc., that we've already taught on the first part of this, Matot. Today we're going to be talking about Masei, which is going to pick us up in Numbers chapter 33. But the entire portion is the Torah of Matot, Numbers chapter 30, verse 2 through Numbers chapter 32. And Masei picks up Numbers 33 through 36, which is going to take us to the end of the Torah portion. The Haftorah reading for this week is Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 4 through 28, and chapter 3, verse 4. And our apostolic writings are Luke chapter 13, 1 through 9, and Mark chapter 11, 12 through 13. So, Sherry, we're going to pick it up today in chapter 33, and we got quite a bit to cover as we're wrapping up the book of Numbers. This book has taken us 38 years of journeying from the time when they have left out of Egypt. They have spent the first part of the book is the first couple years at Mount Sinai, and now we're 38 years later, so we're at year 40 roughly. They're just outside of the Promised Land, and that's where chapter 33, 34, 35, 36 kind of picks up. And we're going to get into the end here. We're wrapping up the beauty of what is happening in to this promise that God made.
Well, and can I also make note that while this is not the end of the Torah, of course we have the book of Deuteronomy, this is the end of the narrative of their story.
That's right.
So we're wrapping up kind of the whole of the story, which is important when you put weight on what were the last things that are in a book. I mean, the book is kind of the end of a book is like the climax of how you tie everything together. So let's keep that in mind as we're reading this. What were the important things that Moshe and the Lord preserved for us?
And the first thing's kind of interesting because it's an itinerary. Basically, in chapter 33, we're getting a list of, okay, here's what we did.
Right, just to recap.
Here's our quote-unquote AAA triptych. This is what we did, right? And so we see that about 1.5 million people are picking up the tent pegs, and they're having to walk and go. And we've talked about this before. Sherry's made the point they were not the wandering Jews, right? They were following the cloud. They were not the Jews at all at this time. They were Israel, but they were following the cloud. They were following the fire, and they were doing what God told them to. So, Sherry, how many times did our ancestors pick up the tent pegs and make a move?
So according to this itinerary, about 42 times. Now, we can read over that. A lot of times when we read these lists in the scripture, we kind of gloss over it. But if you step back just a minute and put yourself in their shoes, this moving to each of these places was no easy task.
No.
Like you said, we're talking about 1.5 million people having to get their cattle rounded up, their children rounded up, their tents folded up. Then you've got the work of getting the tabernacle and all the details of the order of how you cover everything and pack it up and carry it. And then you move out in strategic ways. So this movement was not I'm going to hop in my car and what's my GPS say? I've got, 20 minutes to get. No, this was a major ordeal. So these 42 times, each time we're reading and you read each of these places, recognize it's because they've seen the cloud move, and then the work that it takes to uproot and then reset
anybody
everything.
that's moved. I mean, you
or
just think about moving your house, right? If you're just moving, all of us have moved before, and when you move, you're like, okay, I don't want to do this again. Like, that was so much work to get this moved, to pack everything up. Imagine you're moving on average, at least once a year, and there were sometimes they moved twice a year. In fact, there's one instance where they moved in less than 3 months. So this is kind of a challenge. Now, also in this chapter, we get kind of a summary. Moses is kind of recording some of the events that happened, but interestingly, maybe it's because it's been 38 years. Maybe it's because he's covered this already in the book, and he's just not going to bring it up again. It's already been there. Everybody knows. But he does not recount, for example, the crossing of the Red Sea. He doesn't recount the golden calf.
Except one line. He says, we left from Pi-Haroth, I think was the name of it, through the sea to the wilderness.
Yeah, just one little clip. He didn't bring up much. He doesn't mention the sin of the golden calf. He doesn't mention the war with the Amalekites. He doesn't mention all the murmuring and complaining. He doesn't even speak of Korach and all that rebellion that we've even spent the last several weeks talking about. He doesn't even mention his own sister's death, Miriam. Right. But he does note his brother Aaron's death on Mount Or. And he says in Numbers 33, verse 38, Aaron the Cohen went up Mount Or at Adonai's command and died there. In the 40th year since the departure of Bnei Yisrael from the land of Egypt, on the first day of the 5th month, Aaron was 132 years old when he died.
Now, I did a little math on this because
of course you did.
I'm one that goes, okay, the details are here for a reason. What can I learn from them and what can I see? Okay, if he's 132 years old and they've been in the desert 40 years, that means he was 92 years old when he left Egypt. Now, that is mind-blowing because all the pictures we ever see are a young, strapping man who's, going in, and especially with the golden calf, which you and I were talking about earlier. We see this young, strapping man, not a 92-year-old, or by then 93, 94-year-old. So that kind of shifts the narrative of who he is. We also take note that he died in the 5th month of the Hebrew calendar, which is in our modern, the modern Hebrew calendar calls the 5th month the month of Av. And there are some notable things that happen in Av. It's very interesting. It's become associated with the tragedies of Israel. We have the destruction of both temples happen in the month of Av. They were exiled at the hand of the Babylonians in the month of Av. And then even in our more modern history, we have the tragedies of all the expulsions out of like Spain and the different tragedies that we've seen. And even the Holocaust. Much of the tragedy happens in this 5th month, the month of Av. And this is when Aaron dies. I just thought that was kind of noteworthy.
All right, so they're right there at the edge of the Promised Land, and they've been, over 500 years before this, they had a promise given to them through Abraham, and now Moses and the Israelites are standing there 500 years later about to take this promise. And in verse 53, Masei reiterates this, where he says, "You will take possession of the land, so you will settle in it, because I have given it to you to possess." Now, that's an interesting word. In the Western culture, in our mindsets, we've often thought, I'm going to own something. I want to have ownership in my land. I want to own my property. As a side note, we've often said, Sherry and I have, and I've talked about this publicly periodically, that we don't really own anything, not only in the spiritual context because God owns everything, but even in our natural American way, what do we really own? If they can tax it, they can take it. So if you pay property tax, then at some point somebody else still has ownership to your land. So even in that context, it's that way. But here, Sherry, it's a possession, meaning God is the owner.
I think a better way to think about it is they're really going to be stewards over God's land. And really this patterns the Garden of Eden. I mean, God created the land and created everything, and he created man to steward it. He didn't necessarily give it to man in an ownership way. It was a stewardship. And then we fast forward to here and the land of Israel. I mean, the covenant with Abraham was a land covenant.
Yes, it was.
That his seed will possess this land. And I think we have to really get our mindset around this idea that this is an inheritance. Well, what is an inheritance? An inheritance by nature is a pass-through. I received something from my ancestors. I steward it so that the next generation can have it. So it's this idea really of stewardship. So they're on the cusp of inheriting this promise. I mean, think about the longevity and the way God has guarded this land, the way God has guarded the players, so to speak, that they can be standing here getting ready to have that promise fulfilled.
Psalm 24 and verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord and lords and everything in it and all those who dwell in it. So this is his place. All right, Numbers 34 picks up the borders, and it just reviews, okay, here's the borders, here's the land, here's where it's going to be. So God is just making sure he defines it for them again, and Moses is laying that out, kind of getting everything in order and making sure who's going to have what. And interesting note on there, we'll just make one note about one person that's mentioned. This is Caleb. Caleb is a Kenizzite. Who is a Kenizzite? Well, a Kenizzite was noted in the land covenant you were just talking about with Abraham, that the Kenizzites came from in the land of Canaan. Actually, they are related to Canaan, which was a son of Ham. And so you've got this idea that Caleb was not a natural born Israelite. He's actually, his heritage is from Canaan. So he's kind of going back home, but as a different person. And so here is Caleb now. He is part of the tribe of Judah. In fact, he is the leader of the tribe of Judah, and he's not a natural-born Israelite. And yet Moses never mentions this idea that he's not natural-born. It's just noted he is a Kenizzite who came in. So that's a powerful truth for you to meditate on and think about. The leader of the tribe of Judah was not a natural-born Israelite.
And I think in addition to that, when you think about going to spy out the land, you have Joshua, who is a natural-born Israelite, and Caleb, who is not. We see the threads of the one new man even beginning to take shape, furthering from what we saw from Joseph's children being grafted in.
That's right.
It's just you see the patterns of the scripture, and they just play out time and again.
All right, Numbers chapter 35, excuse me, we get into the cities of the Levites. So this chapter has instructions for the allotment of the Levites. They are going to receive pasture lands in between the lots of the tribes. And so just as a picture for you, this kind of sets up what becomes a modern synagogue system, and what becomes even what the system of Christianity will use thousands and thousands of years later in setting up congregations in different locations. This idea is that we have a temple in Jerusalem, that there will be a temple set, there will be a place for everyone to come and join, but the tribes are going to be spread out, and you can't all meet every week on Shabbat at the temple. So how are we going to meet together, and how are we going to learn the scriptures? How are we going to study and have spiritual life? So the Levites are given allotments of land in between the different tribal territories where they will stay, and they will build houses, and they'll have that place. They don't own that land. They weren't given that land, but they're given an allotment like a lease, and there they will teach from. There they create the spiritual community of leading people and holding people there. And the judges will be there, and all of that. The civil system will be there. So that's kind of how that works, and that develops eventually into a synagogue system, which makes sense.
What's interesting, what's also laid out in this chapter about the Levitical cities, they're told they're going to get 48 cities, 48 land allotments, and then 6 of them, though, have to be designated as what's going to be termed the cities of refuge. 3 of them will be, interestingly, on the Transjordan side, where Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh are, and 3 of them are going to be in the Cisjordan side, on the side where Israel is dwelling. So you've got these 6 cities of refuge, and what these are for is they're designed for anyone who unintentionally murders someone. And this protects them from a term we're going to discuss here in a minute, from the avenger of blood, or the Goel Hadam. Now, the key is that this is unintentional murder. These cities are for unintentional. And what would happen is if you had killed somebody, you would approach the town. They would send you to a court, basically, judge whether it was unintentional or intentional. And if they termed that, yes, you didn't mean to do that, it was accidental, then you can come take refuge here in the city. If not, you got sent back out and you were on your own. You had to deal with this avenger of blood.
And the reason they would send you to refuge was what Sherry just said. There was a requirement for an avengement, a blood for blood situation.
Which we're going to talk about when we talk about this blood avenger.
So this blood avenger. Let's go there, Sherry.
Now, we're going to pull up 8 points about this whole city of refuge, because there's a lot of moving pieces here. But it's important that we kind of understand, again, patterns. God has been setting patterns, and they're coming together even in this ordinance of these cities of refuge. First of all, in verse 15, Adonai reiterates that this is a justice system for the outsider and the visitor in the midst for anyone killing a person by accident. So anybody that's moving into this land with Bnei Israel, this is for all of them. Which again, we see God is not pulling, it's for everybody. The second thing is the cities of refuge really should remind us, it should hearken us back. If you've been listening to our parshas, you'll pick up on this, that the Korban system. Remember, we learned that the Korban system, the sacrificial system, was about unintentional sins. Korban meaning to draw near to God. These sacrifices were given so that we could have a way, if we accidentally sin or we don't realize we've sinned or we just had guilt, that we can bring an offering and have blood covering. If you do intentionally sin, we learned that you have to be cut off from Israel. So this city of refuge is the same thing. If you've unintentionally committed this murder, there's a sanctuary for you. Now, this blood avenger, why don't you talk about that?
So the blood avenger is called the Gohel Hadam. And this is a person, it was usually the patriarch of the family, who would have a duty to avenge the blood of a relative. If somebody killed a relative, the patriarch would have to go and avenge that and do something about it. Now, this is a very ancient Near Eastern culture practice. It happened in all the cultures around Israel, and so in context, Israel practiced it as well. We have to take our mind out of our current mindset. We got to go back and say these are tribal people. They're in a tribal context. This is what they did, and this is how they protected one another. Well, this practice also extended to the role of what became known in Israel and the laws that God sets in place called the kinsman redeemer, that someone would redeem the life of a person, that where there had been a murder or where there had been a death. And this kinsman redeemer, we can see, for example, in the story of Ruth, she's rescued from poverty by her kinsman redeemer. Yeshua, the Messiah, becomes our ultimate kinsman redeemer, recovering us from death. And so this idea of a blood avenger is a protection that happens to the family to say people don't go out and just kill people because somebody's going to come after them if they do. They're setting themselves up. But this place of refuge was set up to say we're going to protect this accidental person from that obligatory revenge, if you will, or avengement that would happen there. And we're reminded in the book of Numbers of a difference here, Sherry, between clean and unclean.
Which again brings in a pattern that we had been learning, even in the Korban system, that you could not have death inside where God dwelled, in the tabernacle. You know, we've been watching them, and we spent a long time looking at the tabernacle and how it was to be laid out, and the animals that had to be, the blood had to be outside of the camp because it couldn't be inside of the camp.
That's right.
Well, that plays into this promised land because the whole land belongs to God.
That's right.
So there can be no unclean blood in the land. So if someone kills someone, now there's blood on the land. So God is setting up a justice system for how do I deal with that. If it's intentional blood, you meant to murder, premeditated murder, then you are subject to being avenged by this Goel Hadam. And that was God's justice system. But if it was unintentional, he provided a way of escape for you.
In fact, verse 33 says, you are not to pollute the land in which you are. Blood pollutes the land. No atonement can be made for land polluted by bloodshed except the blood of the one who shed it. You are not to defile the land where you live, where I dwell, for I dwell among Bnei Israel.
So all of a sudden, all this tabernacle ritual that we've been studying and learning, God was doing for a purpose. Because he's about to make the land of Israel a giant place of his tabernacle, right? It goes beyond the physical tabernacle that man made. It's his land, his holy place, his sacred place. And this is all about the protection of the land, which I think
God
is powerful.
God has taken Israel as a nation and said, I possess them, they are my nation, and now he is saying, now I'm putting them on my land that I possess. It's beautiful.
So a couple of other pieces that come out in this. Remember the cities? These cities were governed by the Levites. Now the Levites were the spiritual directors, like you were saying, teachers of the people. So imagine, here are these murderers that were unintentional. Now they're living in the cities of the Levites. This is kind of like a rehabilitation, right?
It really is.
It's really like the rehabilitation facility, because they're going to come and they're going to get to learn the Word of God at the hands and the feet of these Levites.
Yeah, it really is.
And then the final piece to the structure of the city of refuge is found in verse 25. It says, the assembly must protect the manslayer from the avenger of blood. The assembly should send him back to the city of refuge to which he has fled, and he is to remain there until the death of, get it, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, who was anointed with the holy oil.
Now this is huge.
Yeah. So the land still requires atonement, even for the unintentional sin. It doesn't mean that it's not there, but who pays the price?
Kohen Gadol.
The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, pays the penalty through his own blood.
So, just so you know, the person who's in this city of refuge doesn't ever get to leave until the current high priest dies. They don't kill the high priest, but when the current high priest passes away from whatever cause, at that point, his blood is used, spiritually speaking, to make the land clean of its blood, of its sin. And now the people who committed that sin, they are released. They get freed by the high priest. Now, isn't that interesting that we have a high priest named Yeshua, and he dies, and he pays the price? There are those that have argued that one man doesn't die for another, but here's an exact law of the Scriptures that says, yes, this one man, the high priest, when he dies, it will atone for the sin.
So powerful. As a matter of fact, there's a funny story that's brought down through the sages that they say that the high priest mothers would go to these cities of refuge and take food to encourage them not to pray for the death of her son. Because as soon as the high priest dies, they're released to go back to their family. So we don't know that that's true because it's not in the Word, but it's kind of an interesting understanding that, you know, there is this weight on the high priest, because once he dies, then they're going to be set free.
Which is one of the reasons they are put in this system where the Levites are in control, because there is a rehabilitation going on. There is a spiritual teaching going on. There is the idea that says they're going to be here for a while, and while they're here, they're going to learn of God's ways, so that when the high priest dies and they're released, they're not going to be in this situation again. Finally, we also learn in verse 30 that no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. What a beautiful picture. Where do we get that? Our own justice system does this stuff, right? You got to have more than one witness. And in verse 31, it says, no ransom can be made for the one who has gone to the city of refuge. In other words, there's no bribes that can be taken. There's not a bail set. You don't get out early. This is it. You're in for life until the high priest dies. When the high priest dies, you get free. That's the way it works.
And then there's various other reasons for when you read it, you'll see what defines accidental, what defines non-accidental. But it's
an incredible
picture. The bottom
though.
line is that this really, what the Lord was showing me is this is all about protection of the land. It's the land protection.
All right, we're going to move to chapter 36 here and kind of wrap up the book with a very beautiful little picture here of what God did as he kind of brings some things, quote unquote, full circle, right? In the closing chapter of the book, we encounter these daughters of Zelophehad. I
don't know why. The daughters of Z.
Zelophehad. And they were given the allotment. If you remember, if you'll go back and listen to one of our previous parshas, these are the daughters who went to Moses and they argued and said, hey, look, we don't have an allotment because our father had no sons and we had no husbands, son-in-laws to give these to, and now we're just stuck out here. And Moses went to God, and God changed or adjusted the law, added an amendment to the law, however you want to phrase it, and said they're right. They deserve this. And so now they are given an allotment, and we're going to see this come back now. And
they're actually given the allotment with the half-tribe of Manasseh that's staying on the Transjordan side. And so these leaders of this tribe, they come to Moses and all the tribal leaders, and they kind of look and go, wait a minute, this could create a problem a little bit later on, because if these daughters marry men from other tribes, then we will lose some of our inheritance, because that land will come under the ownership of the new husband. And they also know that in the year of Jubilee that it will go back to the other tribes. So they come going, Moses, this isn't fair. We're going to lose some of our inheritance potentially if these daughters marry outside the tribe. Interesting to note, this does not record that Moses asked God.
Yeah, he may have, but we don't know, right?
He said, "You're right. You're right. That's not right." So here's what's happened. These daughters can marry whoever they want. Be free to marry who you want. But it has to be within your tribe.
Yeah.
You have to marry within your tribe so that the allotment stays within the tribe.
So there was a priority on the land.
Right. Again,
how important is this land? They understand 500 years from the covenant of Abraham to this land. When they are coming in here, they do not take this land covenant lightly. It is not. They believe the stewardship of this land is of paramount importance. It is not lighthearted at all to them. It's not like, oh, I'm going to lose my house. No, this is all that matters to them.
It's the land inheritance. And I think what's so beautiful about when we wrap up this narrative portion of the Torah, in this last chapter, the last two events and things that we see are dealing with the justice system of the land and the blood, unatoned blood, and the actual inheritance of the land and how to protect this inheritance. Because we see that they are not to trade lands. They're not to trade. Tribes are not to trade and negotiate their lands. Once you've been given that allotment, it's yours to steward, to pass to the next generation. Yeah. And there is such power in this to recognize that land was before us. Yes. Before any of us came onto this earth, there was already land. And when we die, the land will be here after us. It outlives us. And so God's protection of that land and this land of Israel, where all of the promises of God are made, the fulfillments of the promises are made, and the return of the Messiah, and our new place we will live, and the new heaven and the new earth will be connected to this land.
Yes, it's so beautiful. So we close out this book with hearkening back to, Sherry was alluding there, to the incredible promise of Genesis chapter 15. And in Genesis 15, Adonai said, on that day, Adonai cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your seed. Mm-hmm. So God took responsibility to make sure that the promise he made to Abram, his chosen servant that he called out, would come to pass. And here at the close of the book of Numbers, and they're going to go and take possession right away now, God fulfilled his word.
I think we should bring up why you can say that God took responsibility. Because if you read that covenant promise just before this verse, what's happening is in the ancient Near Eastern culture, the way that you would make covenant with one another is you would take the animals, you would, in a gross way, you would slaughter them, you would put the animals' halves on either side and create a blood path. And each party would walk through that path, and they would make their commitment to one another with the understanding, if I break this covenant I've made with you, this promise, this what we're saying right now, may I be like these animals, disassembled and a bloody mess, basically. I mean, this was not a sign on the dotted line, find the loopholes. This was both parties agreeing that may we be like this. It's this blood covenant. But in this one, with Abraham, he does the things, he takes the animals God tells him to get, he does the slaughtering, he divides them, he makes, the path is made, because God's making a covenant with Abraham. But Abraham, the word says, was put into a deep sleep. And the only thing that passed through that line was the fiery torch and the smoking oven. God himself was the only one that passed through. And what was he saying in that? Abraham, it was not conditional on Abraham. It was conditional on God. And he was saying, if I don't honor this and give you this land to your seed, then I will be like this as well. He took the full responsibility to fulfill this covenant.
And he took it knowing he was going to have rebellious people that he had to contend with to do it. And 500 years later, here it is.
Here it is. They're standing here going, God has been faithful.
God has been faithful.
Faithful to this land covenant that he made to a people.
All right. It's a beautiful picture. It's a beautiful story. And now we end the book of Numbers, and we will be moving into the book of Deuteronomy, which is the final 30 days before the tribes of Israel fulfill this final piece of the promise and go into the land. So until next time, we thank you for being with us, and we say God bless you and shalom.
Shalom.